How could the most powerful warships of World War II be paralyzed by something as simple as landing a plane? The truth is brutal. A tiny design flaw turned aircraft carriers into floating death traps. Long, flat parking lots where a single missed wire, a single bad touchdown, could ignite fuel, detonate bombs, and freeze the entire deck in a half-hour panic. Pilots had to land perfectly straight down the center line with no margin for error. Miss, and you either crash into a barrier or ditch in the sea. It sounds absurd, but that vulnerability decided battles, until someone realized the fix was not a bigger weapon, but a small geometric trick that would rewrite naval aviation. By 1945, the aircraft carrier is king of the sea, floating airfields that decide battles, but life on deck is anything but regal.
Aboard the USS Enterprise, bringing 30 warplanes home turns into a 45-minute ballet of pure chaos. Planes stagger in low, deck crews sprint between fuel hoses and live ordnance. Signalmen shout through roaring engines, and every movement is a razor-thin choreography where one mistake can end everything. Pilots circle, gauges ticking down. Ground crews work like clockwork, but the tempo is brutal and relentless. It's brilliant power, just maddeningly fragile in practice. The flight deck is a one-way street with no exits. Pilots have to nail a landing so perfectly they might as well be threading a needle from a moving runway. Straight down the center line, wheels on deck, hook on the arresting wire, and stop, every time. There's no room to drift, no emergency lanes, no quick detours.
A single misjudgment means your jet keeps rolling into a wall of parked planes and fueled ordnance, and the whole ship's ballet grinds to a dangerous halt. Precision isn't just preferred here, it's the difference between coming home and never coming back. If a pilot misses the wire, everything can go from routine to catastrophic in seconds. The plane slams into a steel barrier, stopping just feet from a deck stacked with fully armed, fuel-laden aircraft. A ruptured tank or a stray spark, and the whole flight deck becomes a wall of fire with no easy escape. Crews scramble, pilots bail, a single mistake that can turn a carrier into a floating funeral pyre. Even when a pilot nails the approach, the carrier doesn't instantly spring back to life. Operations freeze. Deck crews swarm, arresting wire slackened, tailhook inspected, chocks dragged into place, brakes checked, fuel and weapons teams stepping carefully around a live machine. Men heave and guide with ropes, tractors inch the jet clear. Ordnance crews secure live stores. Every hand moves like a single deliberate organism. For a full stretch of minutes, the whole flight deck is a crossroads with one lane blocked, and while the ship breathes in, every other returning plane is forced to wait. Above, other pilots circle, their fuel gauges ticking toward empty. Radios crackle. Eyes scan that single strip of steel below where everything must be perfect. One botched landing, one missed wire, and the deck snaps shut. Crash barriers, burning wreckage, a runway turned minefield. The deck is frozen, launches stop, recoveries stack up. Those circling fighters become prisoners in the sky, loitering in spirals while minutes bleed away. What should be a 10-minute delay becomes a potential death sentence. Every extra pass eats fuel, and every second raises the chance a pilot will be forced into a choice no one should face. They watch the deck stay closed and feel the options vanish. Circling, fuel bleeding away, hope shrinking by the minute. When recovery is impossible, the only runway left is the ocean. Pilots flip switches, radios crackle, and then with a prayer they lay the jets down on cold water, abandoning million-dollar machines to a merciless sea. The planes sink fast. The crews climb into life rafts and float, shaken and lucky, while behind them the carrier's flight deck remains a frozen parking lot of danger. Ditching saves lives, but it costs the Navy planes, money, and the fragile margin of air superiority. This is the deck cycle problem, A carrier can either launch planes or recover them. It can't do both at once. Think of the flight deck as a one-way street with no exits. One arriving aircraft must come down the center, snag a wire, then be painstakingly moved so the next can land. Miss the wire, and the deck turns into an instant minefield. Even a perfect touch means the whole operation grinds to a halt while crews clear the runway. Pilots circle with dwindling fuel. Sometimes they're forced to ditch. And at the strategic level, that pause turns a carrier from a hunter into a sitting duck. After launching a major strike, a carrier is often left strategically defenseless for over an hour. It's the deck cycle problem. You either push planes out or you take them back, never both. Once the first recovery begins, launch operations grind to a halt. Without fighters on deck, there are no quick intercepts, no cap refresh, no rapid response to incoming threats. Pilots circle with fuel gauges bleeding down. One botched landing can freeze the deck and turn minutes into a life-or-death crisis. In short, that hour is a window of naked exposure, the moment the most powerful ship at sea can be almost helpless. That weakness didn't stay theoretical. It killed. At Midway, Japanese carriers were mid-chaos. Crews rearming planes, deckhands wrestling bombs and fuel into place, pilots shackled into cockpits, all movement choreographed around a single, narrow landing lane. Their decks were literally frozen. They couldn't launch fighters, they couldn't clear the runway, they couldn't stop what was coming. From above, American dive bombers slipped through the clouds and fell like hammers. There was no graceful counterstrike, no scrambling defense, just helpless ships with full magazines and open mouths, exposed in a moment that decided a battle and turned doctrine into a brutal lesson. They became floating funeral pyres. Huge ships turned into tinderboxes the moment their decks filled with fueled, armed planes and the frantic business of rearming began. Bombs lay on pylons like loaded landmines. Fuel tanks glistened in the sun, and crews hustled with lines and wrenches while the ship's ability to fight back vanished. A missed arresting wire wasn't just a crash, it was a catalyst for an inferno that spread across a tight-packed deck in seconds. In effect, the flight deck was less a weapons system than a glorified parking lot. Beautiful, useful, and utterly lethal the moment combat called. That brutal lesson would not be forgotten. A 1943 classified memo from Commander Wade McCluskey laid out a brutal calculus. In a carrier duel, whoever struck first almost never lost. It sounded clinical on paper, but it codified a savage reality sailors already feared. Carriers were only as strong as the moment they could keep airplanes flying. If your deck was busy rearming and recovering, you were a sitting target. Strike windows were razor thin. Miss one, and a single dive bomber run could turn a flight deck into a funeral pyre. McCluskey's memo didn't just record a fact, it became doctrine and a stark warning about the peril of the deck cycle. The war had ended, but a new, unforgiving rival arrived, the jet engine. It wasn't just faster. Jets were heavier, more powerful, and they punished mistakes with brutal immediacy. The graceful, one-way choreography of the straight deck suddenly looked flimsy next to their speed. Approaches that had been tolerated by slow prop planes became split-second gambles. What had been an awkward inefficiency in 1945 now teetered toward catastrophe. Carriers that had survived kamikazes in Midway were suddenly flirting with a kind of obsolescence that could turn routine landings into fiery tombs. The stage was set. The old rules wouldn't survive the jet age. The jet changed everything. Sleek and mercilessly fast, these new birds were also far heavier than the piston planes they replaced, demanding higher approach speeds, tighter landing windows, and a tolerance for error that evaporated overnight. The straight deck that had been a workable, if awkward compromise suddenly looked like a minefield. A missed wire was no longer just an operational headache, it could trigger a chain reaction of fire and explosions on a deck full of fueled, armed aircraft. What had been inefficient was now dangerous. The rules of carrier aviation had been rewritten, and the fleet needed a radical rethink, and fast. It wasn't the U.S. Navy that first sketched the cure to the carrier's fatal weakness. It was the British Royal Navy, pressed hard by reality. Their carriers were smaller, their patrols brutal and unforgiving in the North Atlantic, and every design compromise carried a human cost. Faced with cramped decks, icy seas, and the constant need to keep planes flying, British commanders and engineers started thinking differently. They couldn't afford grand rebuilds or big gambles. Necessity sharpened their focus, and a humble, almost trivial idea began to take shape, a small change in how planes come home that would quietly upend naval aviation. They were an unlikely pair to upend naval orthodoxy: Captain Matthew Slattery, a hard-nosed deck skipper, and Dennis Campbell, a soft-spoken physicist who thought in angles and margins. Together, they sketched a brutally simple question onto a world of steel and routine. What if planes didn't have to slam straight down the centerline? What if they came in at a slight angle, just enough to clear the crowded parking lot that a carrier deck had become? It sounded almost childish in its simplicity, but in a service built on habit, a tiny change in geometry promised to turn a hair-triggered death trap into something manageable, even safe. They grabbed paint and a ruler and drew it on Triumph's weathered deck. A single line, shifted 5 degrees off the center. Tiny, almost laughable. But on paper, it made a different runway. The crew called it theoretical, a thought experiment inked in yellow. Still, watching that slim angle felt like watching a promise, dangerous, hopeful, and very, very real. It looked promising on paper. The little 5-degree line on Triumph suggested a way out of the carrier's choke point. But in practice, the angle was timid. It didn't truly separate launch and recovery. It only nudged the problem sideways. Then the war ended. Budgets tightened, priorities shifted, and the experiment was tucked away into a stack of technical reports no one read. The paint stayed on the deck. The idea became a footnote in naval history, half forgotten. Yet those scrawled measurements and cautious conclusions didn't vanish. They waited, quietly, for someone with time and imagination to find them again. In 1951, a forgotten footnote from the war lands on Commander Walter Boon's desk. He's not an academic. He's a test pilot who's lived the deck cycle in bone-deep detail. Bolters, missed wires, planes circling on fumes while the deck is a locked parking lot. So when he reads the British note, it doesn't read like theory. It snaps into place against a lifetime of approaches and near misses. Suddenly, a line on a deck isn't an abstract sketch. It's a potential lifeline. Boon grabs the data, traces it against his own flight logs, and starts plotting how to turn that idle idea into a real test. Commander Walter Boon digs into the old British notes, and something small clicks into something enormous. He's flown these decks. He's felt the panic when a missed wire turns a carrier into a tinderbox. Reading the data, he stops seeing parking spots and starts seeing a single catastrophic choke point, the one narrow lane where everything must go right or everyone dies. That's the real failure, he realizes, not logistics, but survivability. If that line breaks, the whole operation freezes and pilots burn in the sky. The insight shifts his thinking from rearranging deck space to redesigning the approach itself, and suddenly a radical fix looks possible. Boon's breakthrough is deceptively simple. Tilt the landing lane just a few degrees, around 8 to 10, and the whole danger changes scale. On a straight deck, a bolter, when a pilot misses the arresting wires, ends with metal meeting barrier and fires spreading across a packed flight deck. But with that slight angle, a missed wire no longer points the plane straight into catastrophe. It points down a clear runoff. A bolt becomes a chance to throttle up, fly past the end, loop around, and try again. It's not a new engine or weapon, it's geometry. A catastrophic failure reimagined as a routine, low-risk maneuver. Better yet, instead of slamming into a barrier, the pilot could power up, punch the throttle, and fly off the angled edge, climb away, circle, and come back for another clean pass. No fiery wrecks, no frozen deck, no halted launches. A missed wire becomes a harmless bolter, not the disaster it used to be. It was a stroke of geometric genius, a tiny tilt that changed everything. Instead of a single, brutal failure mode where a missed wire meant a burning wreck and a deck full of explosives, a missed arrestment became a predictable, low-risk touch-and-go. Power up, accelerate, and fly off the angled edge to circle and try again. Suddenly, the deck stopped being a one-way trap and became forgiving space. Sorties could keep flowing. Pilots stopped praying their landing would be perfect. This wasn't just clever drawing on a deck plan. It rewired the Navy's entire approach to risk and tempo. Now, Boon had to sell that idea to a skeptical admiral. Commander Boon stood before Rear Admiral Apollo Susk and laid out the math like a battlefield map. He painted the nightmare of bolters and flaming decks, then offered a single low-cost fix. Tip the landing lane 8 degrees and give a pilot room to fly off. No new catapults at first, no miracle engines, just geometry. It would turn catastrophic crashes into ordinary missed arrest recoveries, keep the deck open for launches, and make jets operational at sea. He spoke with urgency. Jet speeds are unforgiving. This wasn't tinkering, it was survival. If Susk said yes, carrier aviation could survive the jet age. The Navy greenlit a radical experiment. In July 1951, aboard the USS Midway, they didn't cut steel or weld a single new plate. No massive refit, no expensive hardware, just an idea and a will to try it. It was a bet on geometry over grooves, a small, almost audacious intervention that could either look foolish or rewrite carrier aviation. The order went out. The gamble was real. They just paint a line, an 8-degree runway offset from the ship's centerline, creating an entirely new path for landing aircraft. No welding, no cranes. No grand ceremony, just a painter, a chalk stripe, and a risky bet on geometry. On the Midway's deck, men paused and stared. Pilots squinted at the horizon. The idea is almost absurd in its simplicity. Tilt the landing lane a handful of degrees, and you turn a one-way street into a two-way interchange. It looks cosmetic. It feels fragile. But that painted stripe redraws the choreography of every takeoff and landing, and it quietly changes the rules of naval air combat. The Navy simply shifted the wires. With the arresting gear repositioned to that painted angle, the Midway no longer had a single centerline runway. Suddenly she had two, a straight, bow-facing strip for catapult launches and a slanted landing lane cutting across the deck. That small geometric change turned a cramped parking lot into a working airfield, separating arrivals from departures and, for the first time, opening the door to true simultaneous launch and recovery instead of the old stop-and-wait grind. The one-way street has just become a freeway interchange. Two paths painted on wood and steel, an arresting wire moved 8 degrees off-center. Simple to describe, terrifying to bet a Navy on. Would it work in practice? Jets are heavier now, speeds are higher. One misstep and you don't just bend metal, you light a ship. Everything the Navy thought it knew about carrier operations, timing, safety, tactics, rides on a handful of landings on that angled strip. Engineers and captains hold their breath. Crews stand ready. Pilots run checklists. The future of naval aviation isn't theoretical anymore. It's about to be decided on a single approach. Commander Boon straps in and takes the first real run at a line that until this moment has only existed on paper. The carrier holds its breath. He comes in low, precise, the jet thudding onto the deck. The hook snags the wire. Metal shrieks. The brakes bite, and the airplane slides to a stop. Silence breaks into stunned, nervous cheers. It's a clean catch, a perfect success. For a flash, the entire experiment is vindicated. And then the deck hums back to work, because the real proof of the angled deck isn't this landing alone. The true test is what comes next.
Then comes the true test, the moment that will make or break the whole idea. One plane is lined up on the new angled path, wheels thudding on painted deck, pilot locked on the wire, eyes everywhere. At the bow, steam hisses into a catapult. Men shout the countdown. A jet screams forward as the other closes in. Two violent actions, one small deck between them. For a heartbeat, the carrier holds its breath. It works. For the first time in history, a carrier launched a jet from the bow as another aircraft settled onto the angled deck and caught a wire. Simultaneous, surgical, impossible by the old rules. The familiar choreography that once ground operations to a halt vanished in a single thunderous moment. Catapult steam, the slap of tires on wire, jets barking for space, and deck crews moving with a new, breathless tempo. Suddenly, the painted line wasn't theory anymore. It was raw, repeatable power. The 90-minute deck cycle, carrier aviation's Achilles heel, had been shattered, and everyone aboard knew the rules had changed. After that first simultaneous launch and recovery, everything changed. The deck stopped being a one-way street and became a conveyor of power. No more brutal pauses, no more frozen, fuel-gulping turns overhead. Planes came and went in a measured rhythm. Crews moved with a new choreography. Launch and recovery overlapped like twin gears in perfect mesh. That 8-degree line turned a brutal bottleneck into continuous tempo. Sorties flowed, risk dropped, and a carrier could press the attack without surrendering itself to a single failed landing. The future of naval aviation had shifted from fits and starts to an uninterrupted river of air power. Now came the ultimate experiment. On his 7th approach, Commander Boon climbed a hair higher than normal, intentionally high enough to flirt with failure. He wanted to miss the arresting wires. Engines whining, airspeed steady, the whole carrier seemed to hold its breath as sailors and pilots watched a single question hang over the deck. If he boltered, would he smash into the barrier or simply throttle up and fly clear? It was a dangerous, surgical gamble. Prove the angled deck could turn catastrophe into a routine touch and go, or prove it a deadly illusion. His jet touches down and keeps rolling, past the last wire, past the moment every carrier pilot dreads, a bolter. Cold reality in the roar of metal and wind. Boon doesn't hesitate. He slams the throttle to the firewall. The engines bite. Power climbs. The deck blurs beneath him. For an instant, everything narrows to RPM and runway, and one stubborn line painted on steel. This is the test. Failure turned into option, catastrophe into a single savage lever pull. He floors it and prays the geometry he's betting on will let the plane live. Instead of the horrifying screech of metal on steel, the jet answers with a savage roar. Throttle slammed to the firewall, engines spooling up, tires skimming the painted line, and then, impossibly, it climbs. Wings bite the air. Smoke and steam trail down into the gray ocean as the aircraft clears the angled edge and vanishes into the sky, leaving the deck intact and a stunned, cheering crew below. In that single, terrifying second turned triumph, the nightmare of a crash becomes nothing more than a missed wire and another chance to come back. He had proven it. A maneuver that once meant certain, catastrophic crash had been turned into a survivable mistake. The bolter was no longer a death sentence, but a second chance. A pilot could miss the wire, push the throttle, and simply fly back to try again. The implications hit like a thunderclap. Fewer infernos on deck, fewer pilots lost, and the terrifying hour-long blackout between launches and recoveries was no longer inevitable. What had been a clever line on painted steel became a fundamental rethink of carrier safety and combat power, and suddenly the Navy could see a future built around this simple geometry. By September 1951, the Navy no longer treated the angled deck as a curious experiment. It was a solution, and Washington moved fast. Retrofit the entire fleet. The order landed like a detonator. Shipyards woke,
Plans were ripped open and crews readied for a program that would remake carriers from flight deck to keel. For pilots, it promised fewer death-defying returns and more chances to come home. For admirals, it meant far greater striking power. And for the men in the yards, it meant one brutal truth, that an 8-degree line, so simple on paper, would demand a vast, costly reinvention of steel, steam, and shipboard life. But turning a simple painted line into steel and steam was a monumental engineering task, a David versus Goliath challenge that ate years, money, and sleepless nights. What looked like a cosmetic stripe meant cutting open flight decks, hauling multi-ton arresting engines from their foundations, shifting the island, rerouting power and hydraulics, and threading new steam catapults through spaces never designed for them. Shipyards became operating rooms. Welders and riggers worked like surgeons, every bolt and alignment a matter of life or death for future pilots. It wasn't a tweak, it was a top-to-bottom rebuild that would touch every system on the ship. For 30 years, every carrier system, from elevators and hangar deck rails to power runs, fuel lines, arresting gear foundations, and the island's nerve centers, had been laid out for one thing: a straight centerline world. The angle deck didn't just add a stripe, it attacked the ship's DNA. Plans were ripped up, bulkheads were cut, cableways and plumbing were rerouted. Multi-ton machinery had to be moved and realigned. Nothing was spared. A tidy, linear machine had to be remade into something new, which is why everything aboard had to be re-engineered. They didn't just paint a new stripe, yards gutted ships. On 13 Essex-class carriers, a complex, costly surgery began. The island's superstructure, the ship's nerve center, radar, bridges, and funnels, was cut loose, slid over, and rebuilt to one side. Crews pried up decks, rewired command circuits, rerouted ventilation and fuel lines, and craned whole rooms into new positions. It was a brutal ballet of cranes, cutting torches, and midnight welts, because the geometry of flight demanded it. The deck above would change direction, and everything under and around it had to be remade to match. Below deck, the work was brutal and unforgiving. Massive, multi-ton arresting gear engines were ripped from their foundations, suspended on cranes, and painstakingly realigned to the new 8-degree path. Millimeter by millimeter, bolt by bolt, while crews cursed and checked tolerances. With the hangar gutted and the flight deck reimagined, the open ship suddenly became a blank slate for even bolder upgrades. Tearing the decks open wasn't just a painful retrofit, it was a golden opportunity. With hangar bays exposed and foundations ripped apart, engineers shoved in brute force where finesse had failed. New steam catapults, massive and sudden, gave carriers the muscle to hurl far heavier jets into the sky, with bigger payloads and longer range. Suddenly, the carrier was no longer a fragile parking lot, but a mobile launch complex. And because the work left the flight deck exposed anyway, technicians could unplug more than one problem at once, preparing space for new landing aids that would match the jet's demands. They also brought in another British trick, the mirror landing system, essentially an optical glide path that gave pilots a simple, instinctive cue for exactly where to fly the jet. Picture a small, movable mirror and a row of lights that created a meatball of light. Catch it on the center and you're on the right slope. It sounds minor, but for jets coming in fast and heavy, it was a lifesaver. Integrating it with the new angled deck meant recalibrating the whole visual reference so the meatball lined up with the off-center approach, marrying human instinct to ship geometry and making precision landings routine rather than lucky. On deck, it looked like a painted stripe, tidy, almost cosmetic. But below that line was chaos. Dry docks filled with scaffolding, hulls cut open, elevators moved, steam lines rerouted, and arresting engines heaved from concrete foundations. Electricians rewired control rooms. Ordnance crews redesigned handling routes. Pilots and deck crews relearned every motion. What started as a stripe became a top-to-bottom rebuild of a ship's entire flight system, hull to island, wiring to workflow, a months-long operation that turned carriers inside out and ready for a very different kind of war at sea. In December 1952, the USS Antietam steamed out as the world's first operational angled deck carrier. There was no parade, no fanfare. She was sent straight into a trial by fire off Korea, a bold experiment under enemy skies. Technicians held their breath. Admirals watched the deck. The men on board knew that for better or worse, the future of carrier aviation would be decided there. Tests on the calm of peacetime had been promising, but aboard the carriers and in the hushed offices in Washington, doubt lingered. Senior admirals, engineers, and budget hawks watched with folded arms.
This wasn't a small tweak to a runway. This was a multi-billion-dollar bet on the future of naval aviation, and one ship's performance in a combat zone would decide it. If Antietam failed, conversions and new designs would be quietly reversed. If she succeeded, the old doctrine would be swept aside. So the Navy sent her to Korea not for a parade, but for a verdict, and every eye was fixed on the deck. Beside a sister ship still anchored to the past, Antietam looks like a different world. Jets roar off the bow. Others touch down on the angled line and roll clear. Launch, recover, repeat. Constant, efficient, relentless. Sailors who'd spent careers arguing the deck's limits watch slack-jawed as sorties stack up. For the old guard, the math of carrier warfare has just been rewritten. The initial data was staggering. A single painted line and the angled deck delivered a 74% increase in raw combat power. In plain terms, Antietam could put far more planes into the air and bring them back alive, faster and with far less chaos. Sortie rates jumped, turnaround times collapsed, and the 1-hour blackout after strikes evaporated. Carriers could sustain pressure instead of pausing to recover. Losses from botched landings and fuel-starved pilots circling helplessly fell sharply. Strategically, a carrier stopped being an easy target during recovery. Tactically, commanders gained freedom, and for the pilots on deck, everything that followed would feel, quite literally, like a new lease on life. For pilots, the change was nothing short of life-altering. Before the angled deck, every recovery felt like a roll of the dice, a 50-50 shot the landing area would be clear when you came back from a mission. You circled low, burning precious fuel. You prayed for a perfect approach. You imagined ditching your airplane and, worse, hoping you didn't ignite the deck below. The angled deck erased that roulette. Landings became predictable. Misses turned into go-arounds instead of explosions. Stress fell away. Crews breathed easier. Missions stayed intact. What had been luck became procedure, and that simple shift saved planes, lives, and the mission itself. On Antietam, deck availability shoots up to 79%. Suddenly, the endless, fuel-burning circles that used to eat pilots and planes are gone. Landings that once halted every launch now happen without grinding the ship to a halt. Sortie tempos climb, stress drops, and what had been a gamble, returning to a packed, dangerous deck, becomes routine and, crucially, survivable. Pilots stop holding their breath on final approach. Commanders can plan sustained strikes without praying no one misses a wire. The numbers don't lie. The angled deck isn't just safer, it changes the calculus of naval air power. And a few weeks later, Lieutenant James Miker would see exactly why. In February 1953, Lieutenant James Miker watched the angled deck prove itself in the harshest possible way. In a single day, he saw 3 crews spared from certain disaster, an already trashed Skyraider limping home, an F-9F coming in with a live bomb dangling from its pylon, and a confused pilot who nearly flew into the sea. Each time, the same miracle, an open, offset lane to aim for, room to roll or go around, and no deathly pileups on the parking deck. For Miker, theory became reality. The angled deck stopped being an experiment and started saving lives. First,
A heavily damaged Sky Raider limped home, its blackened fuselage riddled with holes and smoke stinging the cockpit. Instead of a jammed, impossible landing, the angled deck offered a clear, open runway. The pilot had room to come down, catch a wire, and taxi off without risking the dozens of armed, fueled planes waiting for launch. It was a quiet miracle, and only the first of 3 saves that day. Next, an F-9F pilot limps in with a live bomb stuck to his wing pylon. One wrong jolt and the deck could become a furnace. On a straight deck, he'd be a walking time bomb. No room to land, no safe place to put down without threatening every armed plane parked for the next launch. The angled deck changes the math. A clear, offset runway gives him space to touch down and taxi clear, or to wave off and reattempt, while deck crews isolate the hazard. What would have been a catastrophe becomes a controlled emergency, another life and dozens of aircraft saved by 8 degrees of geometry. Finally, when a disoriented pilot came in low and wrong, almost flirting with the ocean, the angled deck turned a certain catastrophe into a second chance. Instead of slamming into a barrier or skidding into parked aircraft, he had room to throttle up, roll past the wires, and climb away. Time, space, and a clear corridor that let a panicked approach become a controlled go-around. Deck crews held their breath, then let out a single relieved shout as the jet cleared the bow. Small moments like that, planes saved, crews spared, began to add up, proving this line on the deck was about more than efficiency. It was about survival. By March 1953, the numbers were no longer rumors or anecdotes. They were a fact, stamped in black and white. The USS Antietam was flying nearly twice as many combat sorties per day as its straight-deck sisters. Sorties came faster, recovered cleaner, and returned crews walked away instead of being counted in hospital logs. Missions that once chewed through fuel and nerves now fed a steady drumbeat of strikes, each cycle closing faster than the last. For pilots and deck crews, the angled deck didn't just improve efficiency, it multiplied firepower and bought lives back. The data was clear, and Washington could no longer ignore it. Captain John Cromlin didn't send a plea, he sent a dispatch, crisp, relentless, and full of numbers you couldn't argue with. Sortie rates, deck availability, near misses that became rescues. He attached pilot reports, maintenance logs, and a simple recommendation. The telegram hit Washington like a verdict. Conversations stopped. Skeptics who'd mocked the angled deck found themselves without an argument. Procurement officers saw budgets that suddenly made sense. Overnight, a technical debate became a strategic imperative. The carrier navy had been given a new lifeline, and Cromlin's one-page report closed the book. The question was no longer whether, but how fast the fleet could be remade. His report was blunt and impossible to ignore. An angled deck didn't just shave minutes off a recovery cycle. It increased a carrier's striking power by at least 85%, and he recommended immediate fleet-wide conversion. That line on a page turned a risky experiment into a strategic imperative. It reframed the debate from if to how fast. Budgets, shipyards, and admirals all had to move. For the pilots who had begged for safer landings, it was vindication. For the Navy, it was a clear choice: embrace the angle or be left behind. The skeptics are silenced. Men who had mocked the painted line now read Captain Cromlin's figures in stunned silence. Sortie rates soaring, deck availability jumping, crews coming home alive when before they wouldn't have, and an old carrier suddenly able to fight like two. Debate collapses into calculation. Briefing rooms that were full of excuses empty into blueprints and retrofit schedules. Admirals trade stubbornness for spreadsheets. Engineers sketch islands pushed over, catapults upgraded, arresting gear re-angled. Pride gives way to pragmatism. Overnight, the angled deck stops being a theory and becomes doctrine, the quiet pivot that will remold every carrier to come. The success was so complete that by late 1953, the Navy gave up the slow, expensive ritual of retrofitting and ordered a clean start. Ships designed from the keel up to be carriers first, not patched cruisers with runways bolted on. It wasn't a tweak, it was a rewrite of naval architecture. Flight operations became the organizing principle. Islands pushed over, catapults laid out, arresting gear and hangars planned around an angled runway. That simple painted line had proved it could double a carrier's striking power, and now the fleet would be built to think, move, and fight around that geometry, forever changing carrier warfare. They didn't just tack on a fix and call it done. The Forrestal class was born around the angled deck. The deck wasn't an afterthought, it was the spine of the ship. Hull lines, hangars, elevators, island placement, power plants, even the steam catapults were planned to feed a continuous flow of aircraft. Every corridor and control room oriented to keep launches and recoveries moving without pause. It was a naval roof raising, a whole warship reimagined to exploit a single geometric idea. That shift from retrofit to native design turned a clever trick into doctrine and set the stage for what came next on the USS Forrestal. On the USS Forrestal, the idea stops being an add-on and becomes the ship itself. The island is shoved hard to the flank, clearing a sweeping, unobstructed flight deck, and 4 massive steam catapults are built in as if they were part of the keel. Those catapults give the carrier raw muscle. They can fling heavier, faster jets off the bow on demand, while the relocated island and angled lane let recoveries happen without halting launches. The result is a continuous, choreographed flow of air power. Launches and landings intermingle, tempo rises, risk drops, and a single ship suddenly behaves like an entire carrier group. During sea trials, the Forrestal does something that used to live in the realm of fantasy. She launches 2 jets every 30 seconds, and at the same time recovers another aircraft roughly every minute. It isn't chaos, it's choreography. Steam catapults huff, arresting wires snatch, deck crews move with surgical speed, and pilots come and go in a continuous loop of power. What used to be a stop-and-start ballet becomes a steady, roaring river of sorties, each launch feeding the next recovery and vice versa. In practice, this isn't just faster operations, it's a transformation of what a carrier can be. The new operational tempo didn't just shave minutes off a schedule, it rewrote strategy. Soviet planners, who had built doctrine around striking during the long, helpless recovery cycles, suddenly found the very hole they'd aimed at had been sealed. Carriers could launch and land in a steady stream. There were no predictable windows of weakness to exploit. Deterrence hardened. Fleet commanders had to rethink ambushes, timing, and even the ships they'd count on. What had been a tactical trick became a strategic barrier. American naval air power could now press, persist, and survive in ways the old world never imagined. It wasn't a clever hack or a temporary patch, it was a new operating principle. By marrying an angled landing area with steam catapults and an optical landing system, navies turned a deadly bottleneck into a continuous flow of air power, safer recoveries, faster launches, and far fewer mid-deck disasters. The geometry proved shockingly scalable, swallowing heavier, faster jets and new cockpit tech without losing its core advantage. Within years, every major carrier force adopted the layout, and it stuck, not as a trend, but as standard doctrine. More than 7 decades later, that 8-degree idea still shapes the world's carriers, proving the simplest fixes can be the most enduring. From the F-4 Phantom to the F-35 Lightning, that 8-degree trick quietly carried every leap in speed, weight, and complexity the Navy could throw at it. New engines, new avionics, new landing speeds. The planes changed, but the deck's geometry did not. It absorbed them all. Walk the flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford today, and you're staring at the same angled choreography Boon painted on the Midway. An identical slope, the same forgiving margin for error, the same promise of continuous air power. It's a reminder that sometimes the most radical inventions are simply seeing an old problem from a different angle. That simple 8-degree line did more than rearrange steel. It doubled a fleet's striking power, saved countless lives, and underwrote American naval dominance for decades. It turned a carrier from a fragile parking lot into a continuous generator of air power, let jets land without turning every recovery into a gamble, and forced navies to rethink how you build a warship from the keel up. The genius wasn't exotic tech, but a tiny shift in geometry and mindset, a proof that the biggest revolutions often start with the smallest change in perspective.
In the end, victory came not from more force, but from seeing the problem from a different angle.